Go ahead, Jermaine. You go first.
All right, I'll go first. Though it seems problematic as the only male on the panel on International Women's Day, but I'll go first. Also acknowledging the importance of celebrating and honoring women on Women's Day. The theme inspiring inclusion and embracing inclusion. So I think it's fundamental to talk about gender within the context of genocide. I call gendercide genocide within a genocide, because in many instances, when we talk about gendercide, we don't strip the layers off, and the layers include how killing is often gender specific, that most of the perpetrators of killings are indeed men, and many of the people who suffer, not just those who suffer in terms of dying, but also those who suffer in terms of trauma, physical and especially sexual trauma, are women. And so gendercide is the systematic killing, the intent to kill or destroy within the context of a specific gender. In my work, I do the Armenian genocide, I do indigenous genocides here in the Americas, and I also do genocide, the Ma'afa, the African Holocaust, in terms of the transatlantic trade in Africans. Gender is critical to my work, and maybe more contemporaneously, in conversations about recent genocides, especially Rwanda, Burundi, Cambodia, those that I've studied closer, the reality of it is that gender also complicates some of the analysis of genocide. I think of the Rwandan genocide and the ways in which the order to authorize rape of women was actually made and sanctioned by a woman, right? The Minister of Welfare Affairs. Ironic that she was a minister, Pauline Nir Ramasuhuko. She was the Minister of Welfare Affairs, but she ordered men to rape women. And so I think in thinking about gendercide, we have to change the lenses through which we understand not just the killing and violation, but our keynote speaker did it yesterday in talking about rape, not simply as a sexual act, but as a political act. And I am very mindful of that in my work. I teach a course on genocide, and every class I teach, I give a disclaimer that the details to be discussed may be inherently traumatic and graphic, but necessary to discuss. And as you can imagine, most of the students are women. And so I'm constantly aware of the ways in which patriarchy operates, the lenses through which we interpret genocide. And so I'm mindful of my role as a man here talking about gendercide. But it's important to understand that patriarchy needs not just men to have its maintenance, women also help to maintain patriarchy. And so the system of genocide that happens, especially in places like Rwanda, required the complicity of women. And I think in much of my analysis, I'm becoming acutely aware that women are agents, even if many times they are subjects of genocide.
Who wants to go next? Janine?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, again. So glad to see you, it was a long day yesterday, and so it's so nice to see that you came back and with new people here. So what my engagement with genocide studies and then gender and genocide was almost natural, since I'm a survivor of a genocide that killed mostly men by nature. It was a selective genocide in 1972 in Burundi, for those of you who don't know. So the killers were majority men, and the victims were men, selected because of some fake identity. I say fake because there was nothing natural in the identification, in being called Hutu or Tutsi in Burundi and now in Rwanda. There was nothing natural there. So just a quick reminder for those of you who are not familiar with the Hutu Tutsi troubles in the Great Lakes, Africa. So the Hutus and Tutsi and Hutu are in similar numbers in Burundi and Rwanda. In Burundi, in Rwanda, Hutu are about 85% of the population. In both countries, Tutsi are about 14% of the population. And that 1% left is of Twa people, a small minority in almost every area, because Hutus were majority. Now, this is why distinctions happen in Burundi and Rwanda. I try to be quick. Hutu in Rwanda have been majority in number and in power for a long time, until 1994, when RPF arrived, and then the genocide happened. Then there was a flip in the government. Then in Burundi, Hutu were majority in number, but minority in power, and until recently. So that has really caused lots of problems, which led to genocides in both countries. And but let me call your attention to one thing, and and this is from my own reading and studying. I told you yesterday how I've been asking questions, and one of them was like, how did this happen that they start hitting each other? So the word Hutu, the word Tutsi are Kirundi, are Kinyarwanda. So these are not foreign words. But who did they apply to? These were socioeconomic relationships between the Hutu and the Tutsi before colonization. But colonizers came in and used those words to pin people against each other, to divide and rule, as you heard all day yesterday and today. So from socioeconomic relationships, they became sociopolitical relationships. So then they colonizers started promoting one group against the other. In Burundi, the Tutsi were promoted. In Rwanda, the Hutu were promoted. And this, I won't get too much into detail, but it was started by military officer Guy Logist. He's a Belgian, so anybody who's doing research, look him up. He was the one who really thought he would find a solution for the exploitation that was already set up. He said, okay, Hutu revolutions. There was a Hutu revolution in Rwanda in 1959. So if you can look that up, it starts getting you like understanding what these troubles in the Great Lakes Africa are happening because of Hutu and Tutsi. Small groups, if you look at all other African, African populations, why are these causing so much trouble in the Great Lakes Africa? Okay, back to gender and genocide. So in Burundi, the widows, imagine we lost more than 200,000 people, and we have so many widows from that time. And indeed, later on, as our keynote mentioned earlier. So you have these widows who have not been talking. These are our forgotten voices. So even with those who many researchers who wrote about 1972 genocide were really listening to men, not the widows. And so recently, when we visited Burundi, our research group, we went and saw, we talked to some members of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, said, so how about women? What's their role? And we're very grateful because the person we were talking to said, we realize that's a problem. We've tried to engage them. Every time they say, okay, we want to hear about the stories of 1972, the survivor stories. Guess who comes first? Men. Women are still in the background. They don't come, yes, I'll tell you my story. No, they are in the background, you see. So really, we still want, there's almost like a sense of urgency to get women more on the forefront of telling the stories of what happened to them. They are the core survivors. Yes, they are orphans, of course, but the widows are so many and they have a lot to share with us. They're the ones who have been resilient to keep the families going after they lost the breadwinners, after they lost or the support that they were supposed that they had, because most of them were stay-home parents, mothers. But in the fact, I mean, those who were killed, and by the way, those who were killed were the ones who had were elite, you know, educated, businessmen, administration personnel, chauffeurs, clerks, and so on. So those were the ones who were killed. So they were the breadwinners. And so these mothers were left with nothing. And more than that, those who, like I'll give you an example in my case. So my father gets killed. We don't know where. They just disappeared. But within a couple of weeks, people come and change locks on his business stores. They change locks and start doing business as normal, right? How did they know that he was dead? That's a question I keep asking, because we didn't have a body. So surely one of them, the people we know, must have known that he had been killed. So that's how we know many times that the neighbors are the ones who were the killers, you know. So they took they changed, you know, they took all the property, I mean, land, everything. It was horrible, like becoming poor overnight. That happened to so many families in Burundi in 1972. And today, when we went to collect stories in December, we saw that poverty, now generational poverty from that time. These were mothers and children who were not supposed to be poor today. But today we've seen, again, we heard the stories of these women who have been poor since then. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. Bennett, you want to go?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Zainab from Nigeria. And can you hear me now? Wonderful. Okay. I will be talking more of my experiences and in Nigeria, right? I focused more on right from the Nigerian election, Boko Haram, and ISWAP, you name it. So from the presentations, right, that we had yesterday, from the keynotes from Dr. Ohab, from Anna's presentation, even today's presentations, we've had a kind of link, or we've noticed a trend of women's experiences in cases of violence and genocide being relegated to the background, right? As Janine just mentioned. So looking at Boko Haram situation, I'm sure almost everyone here are aware of the Chibok girls, right? The kidnap of 2014, right, by Boko Haram. And I assure you, there have been several others since then, but that is actually the trending one that everyone is aware of. Like, these girls get kidnapped, right? They get raped, they get forced into marriages, they even bear children for these terrorist groups, right? Not only that, some of them are turned into child soldiers, where they would have to carry out attacks on their own villages, right? So all of this is happening. Now, I believe that to understand genocide, we need to stop viewing it from the 180, what I call the 180 lens that we are using currently. We need to start acknowledging the fact that the experiences gender brings to the table, right? How people experience violence, the way they are victimized, right, is totally different in different genders. So we need to start acknowledging this and look at the roles and experiences of men, women, even the LGBTQ plus, right? Identifying that these experiences would enable us to have a robust understanding of genocide, of people's experiences and how they relate with violence. So for me, it's been an experience being here and an eye opener because back in Nigeria, I never thought of gender and genocide that way until I came here. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, how did I miss that? I should know that, right? Because I traveled through the street of Kaduna where people were kidnapped days before I traveled. And on that same road, I remember hearing the stories of how people were kidnapped on that same road a couple of days before I got there. And I remember thinking, what if I get like different people, different terrorists, right, busting out from bushes to attack us? What would I do at that point, right? So how did I miss the gender part of genocide? So that has become an eye-opener for me and an area I think I want to really focus on to look at it. For anyone who knows, I've always spoken about the communication triggers, right, in genocide, and I'm more interested in the preventive measures that we can take before we get to the act itself. That is what I look into. That is what I'm interested in. How do we stop it before it happens, right? So, yeah, that's just it for me. I'm still learning, so hopefully I get to hear more and to learn more from others. Thank you.
Thank you.
Karen, your turn.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sharon Bethia, professor here at Northeastern and a part of this illustrious group. And it's quite an honor to be part of GHRAD. So when I think if I got the question right, this notion of how studying genders impacts my work. I know yesterday I talked a little bit about that notion of AI or African intelligence. This notion of the power of women, right? We begin to talk about the power of women. So it's, African history or African diasporic history is scarred by these episodes of genocide. The narrative about and the unique impact of genders is usually overlooked, right? So as we talk about the gender-based violence, the differences of the violence between men and women, I like to look at this notion of women as heroes in genocide, right? How do we unveil the resilience of women in genocide? After being inflicted with unimaginable suffering, tearing apart of communities and leaving scars that endure for generations, amidst the horror, women emerge as unsung heroes, embodying extraordinary resilience, courage, and strength in the face of unimaginable adversity. Sounds like women, right? So I'd like to talk more about how women were heroes when it comes to genocide, highlighting their agency, highlighting their leadership, highlighting their survival resistance, and highlighting how they're rebuilding and actually shattering these thoughts. So, survival and resilience, resistance and defiance. So these stories, I remember being over at the exhibit and actually there's a picture of a stunning woman. They're all stunning. But I heard somebody say, might have been somebody in here, so if I'm repeating your words, kinda, that might have been Colette. That it doesn't make any sense that that much beauty was given to one woman. Was that you, Colette? Yeah. Yeah. And so you're sitting there and just looking at the power in their eyes. So how do we begin to not only talk more about women as heroes in this? 'Cause I think we tend to either ignore them or we talk about them being victims. And yes, there's that victim trauma
Down
part.
to them.
Hmm?
Talk down to them.
Talk down to them, yeah, absolutely. And so how do we talk about that? Not only were there more than victims, that they're the caregivers, activists, leaders, and that we honor their courage and their sacrifice and their unwavering commitment to justice and dignity, because that's who women were. So as we talk more, we talk about these untold stories of courage in Burundi that women did, acts of resistance, advocates for peace, preservation of memory, and this notion of how we're actually women are part of in genocide, this notion of reparation, reconstruction, and the dirty word reconciliation, right? Whatever that means. But I just also believe that none of that can happen until reparations happens. So what are women's roles in that? Not only in their stories, their dialogues, their healing, the notion how women have social cohesion, keep family together, and has also laid the foundation for this notion of inclusivity, resilient society. And just in some of my research, giving a shout out specifically in Burundi to some of the women that kind of stand out, like, and Janine, you're gonna have to help me with some of these names. Marguerite Barankitsky, yeah. Odette Carrere, Immaculée Nahau Yo. And I would often say that when my people were taken forcefully to come to this country, that they also took my tongue. So as I struggle through and understand more the language of our people, please forgive me for saying names, to them, for saying their names wrong. Annociata Gasparini and Sylvie Bakuru. Yes, and those are some of the women in Burundi who are exemplifying this notion of courage, resilience, and leadership of women, and specifically in Burundi. Thank you.
Throw my 2 cents in as well. So I've been thinking in my work and over the course of this conference as well about how genocide is essentially gendered in a sense, insofar as it involves the elimination of a population, right? So it's a question of reproduction and the control of its reproduction, either by killing its women or by controlling or appropriating women's reproductive capacity. And this is a theme that I think we're seeing in many of these papers. We've seen this with Boko Haram in particular, and with Bosnia and Herzegovina. I always pronounce that wrong. But those are only examples. And this is something we see in Burundi too, right? Insofar as land, cows, and women are associated with fertility, wealth, and power. And they become sort of key resources of contestation through cyclical political violence. So, you know, we can also see the political mobilization of homophobia, and not to mention abortion, right, through this lens, as a cynical channeling of anxieties about reproduction. I look at that issue in my work with respect to discrimination against migrants. This kind of discrimination is consistently racialized worldwide. And it so often involves a blind eye to labor exploitation on one hand, but also xenophobic rhetoric surrounding migrant fertility and birthright citizenship on the other. So there's generally concern about the reproductive capacity of migrants, even as they are necessary for, well, supply chains to function, right? So this raises a really frightening trend among defenders of the patriarchy, which is a hierarchical model of social order that is so often racist as well as sexist and homophobic, that reduces women to their reproductive capacity and rejects LGBTQ because they are not reproductive unions. And I wonder to what degree these trends are related to the prediction that demographers are in consensus with at this point, that we're actually going to see a decline in the human population beginning in 20 to 30 years. Right, we're seeing shifts in global dynamics of power that have a lot to do with changes in the environment and changes in our interaction with the environment, not only through the ways in which capitalism has transformed the world that we live in, even in its most remote corners, right? But also in the ways in which we function as a species, right? So I think about this as a way of reconsidering the relationship between nature and culture, the relationship between humans and the world that we live in. And it, of course, begs the question of how we can live in balance, not only with each other, but also, you know, with our land, with our environment. So that's my answer.
Thank you.
On to the next question, which is, what is missed in studies of genocide that do not explicitly address gender. I mean, I think, Jermaine, you sort of touched on this already in your response. There's a lot of work on genocide that doesn't mention gender at all. And so what's the problem with that? What gets missed?
I think in many ways, what is missing from the analysis is the intersectionality of gender with other types of identities. You know, for the class that I teach on genocide, one of the things that we have to first do is to deconstruct the nomenclature, deconstruct these words that we've come to assume have one single standard meaning, right? I asked them to genderize war as like power is masculine, right? That's a perception. You know, my thought experiment, the first class is, tell me how many wars have been initiated by women, right? And tell me how many female heads of states initiate war or initiate genocidal violence, right? To get them to begin to think about the ways in which power is manifestly androcentric. And so we have to talk about representations of power that move away from just simply making it masculine. I think we also miss in not using gendered lenses to talk about and to talk through genocide. We miss the dual role of women, that we can't singularize them to say that they are just simply passive bystanders. They are activists, they are agent-oriented, they have agency, and in many ways, the Burundian experience added this layer that in many ways, while men may have suffered in terms of physical death and maiming from genocide, the women are left to bear everything else. And so our research team, one of the themes we were exploring was a very important question: where are the women? Because we assumed the women weren't there, but they were very much there. We were just not giving them the right and proper place in our analysis. They were always there. Their work was always there. They had to be economically resilient. And so I think if we begin to explore including gender in our analysis, I think intervention will be better understood. Strategies of intervention would be better understood if we include gender in our analysis. More effective strategies of prevention would also be assisted. And then I call these the 3 R words. Sharon says one of them is a bad word. Reconstruction, reconciliation, and reparation. But reparation is not just simply the question of material compensation. It is psychological repair, right? It is humanistic repair. And so I think if we are to understand genocide better, we have to not just include the gender dimension, we have to include women in the analysis, that they're not on the periphery of the analysis, but they're central to our understanding of gender and genocide. Finally, I think of the way in which cultural assimilation happened within the context of residential schools for Indigenous peoples here in the US and Canada. And I think again of the ways in which the story, even the very motto of the Carlisle Industrial School, kill the Indian and save the man. Not save the person, save the man. In other words, women are not to be saved, right? They are damned, they're doomed, and men can be saved, and then men can save women. Even the very idea of that patriarchal tone, when these women preserved their culture, even when they couldn't speak their language, right? And so we can't get better genocide analysis until and unless we include women in the analysis.
Until we include women in our analysis. I love that.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Where do I start? Growing up, I always knew women were powerful in the court system, believe it or not. So the word for judge or honorable elder, it literally in Kirundi is umushingantahe, means the one who uses a gavel. So umushingantahe is the word for elder, the trusted man, and so on. So women, so naturally women were not, the gavel users were not, but internally, culturally, at the end of the day, when the men gathered to discuss a case, you know, a theft or something, they would say, well, we're going to go home and the night will inspire us. Okay, and then they come back the following morning and they say, oh, we have answers. So those answers came from the women in the home, of course.
Mhm.
So when we don't include women, thank you, Dr. McAlpin, we are missing out. When we try to study and promote studies of genocide and peace building and healing and all of that, without bringing women, putting them in the center, we're missing out from skills that they have naturally of peacemaking. I mean, talk to a mother who has who has many children. They know how to bring peace building. To talk about them in the community, look at what they do to bring peace. So naturally, they are peace builders, peacemakers. So of course, everybody's talking about agency of peace. They bring, they have the right skills to reconcile people. They are respected in their own ways, but here is the problem. In state-sponsored, especially, I'm going to focus on state-sponsored atrocities, that's silenced. They are silenced in not being able to talk about their pain. They are forbidden from mourning, and I'm focusing on Burundi, Rwanda, Great Lakes in general, Great Lakes, Africa. Those widows, there are widows who haven't been able to say, yesterday we talked about that, there are widows who haven't been able to express themselves, and therefore they are not given that space to bring peace because they haven't been able to deal even with their own problems. They haven't been able to tell the world how they have suffered. So there are many women who are great detectives, but they are not allowed that space to use their skills. And so I will conclude my remarks for this question, giving you the example of my mother. So my mother is illiterate, doesn't know how to read and write. But I'll give you 3 cases that show she's the only one. I know, listening to all the stories that we've been collecting, she's one of many Burundian women who have been able to really use their resiliency to keep their societies, their local communities together. One, before, and I know this may be a little confusing, but before my father got killed, he had a Hutu. Yes, go figure. So this Hutu Tutsi thing was not political in the first place. It was a socioeconomic situation, as I said earlier, because if you gave a cow to someone, that family will become Hutu of the giver of the cow. So my father had given a cow to family, and they were our Hutu. So every month they would bring gifts to our family. So that relationship, when my father passed away, my mother canceled that contract. Said, I remember her telling this man, the one who was bringing us those with his children, he said, okay, now you go home. His name was Nduwabike. You go home, take care of your family. So imagine this is a Tutsi woman who's canceling out this relationship that was national, that was everywhere, but she was one who did it. There were many other people who kept their Hutus, but she canceled that contract. That's one thing I lived and I experienced myself. 2, The relationships between the Twa people that I mentioned to you that were really just the minority of minorities. They were the castes, like in India, caste system, they were the untouchables. But my mother would serve us food and would say, you are eating with this Hutu. And we would, with this Twa person. In other families, we've seen where they go like, oh no, I can't touch her, I can't touch him. They would sell us clay pots, but they were given food, if anything, in a corner, just remote, just disdain. It was horrific. My mother would say, no, you're eating together with those Twa people. And so we grew up knowing that we cannot look down on anybody. That's number two. Number three, when my father died, those who took our property, our stores, were all happy, living a happy life, their children going to school, they could afford all of that. And so my mother decided to go claim property after property. So she started with pieces of land. This is a woman, a widow, standing in front of all men court. And she would rehearse. I remember her rehearsing what she was going to say. They ask this, I'm going to say this, they ask this. It was beautiful to watch. She may have been like 35 years old at that point, but she won property by property, except the stores we did not get. It was more, the whole country was like, nope, those were property of the state. So they just gifts that they gave to people. So, this is to say women are powerful. If they could be brought to the spaces that we need to put them in, our societies will be so much better. And I know I'm biased, but I know we can prove that, of course, with all what everybody else is saying, and the research says so too. Thank you.
In agreement with everything that both Dr. Jermaine and Dr. Janine, I know the rhyme is confusing a little bit. So yeah, with everything they've said, ignoring gender would lead to us having inaccurate knowledge on genocide. That's what I believe. Incorporating the experiences of women, incorporating the vulnerabilities would actually give us more access to understand what genocide is, right? To understand how we can actually, how vital it is to include the experiences of these women for us to be able to come up with preventive measures. Just like Dr. Jermaine mentioned, we need women at the table, right? In Nigeria, I know women are beginning to find their voices, and we now have so many activists, women activists. That still needs to translate to a bigger picture. We have laws, but are they being followed? Are they being carried out? No, right? So the experiences of women is vital in understanding the scope of genocide. So we need to actually look into this and find a way to include women in the discussion, in the conversation when we're talking about genocide, when we're talking about mass violence. If you've been to countries where these things have happened, you would notice one trend, right? Women are in the background, always. So we need more visibility in this. Thank you.
Yes, we're thinking, I'll be a little specific to Burundi. If we talk about the lasting effects of genocide on a population, it is critical that we talk about the context of genders, and for this specific panel around women, because not only the challenges unique, the challenges for women and the impact of women impacts an entire nation. I often tell my students that the world is full of women and their children. Think about it, right? That for you to come through, you got to come through my womb. Just do, right? There's other scientific things that go on, but when it comes down to it, that's what the world is full of. And we're born with our children. I often would tell my son, dude, I was born with you, your grandmama was born with you, she was born with me, and understand, right, that's nation building. So we even think about the simple, not simple, displacement and refugees, specifically in Burundi, that thousands of people were forced. A huge significant of them women and children, and they're fleeing their homes. So again, women protecting the community, women protecting family, right? As they ran with their children. How do we not have that story told, right? In understanding not only genocide, but nation building and peace building after that. Even in the midst of the exploitation, abuse, and trafficking, women were resolved, had their own agency, and they were resilient. Even with all the statistics on sexual violence, right? Subjugation. And I still grapple with this notion of sexual exploitation being a part of war, as we even read about it and talk about it now. Just as you talked about how it started, but still the notion of that part of my warfare is that I literally rape some women to death, right? Until they're totally, you've seen the stories. How do we actually tell this story without hitting the story of women? The weaponization of sexual violence, the notion of physical harm. Because what that leads to is, when we talk about the impact of women on a nation, is more information about maternal health. Because what we find because of these atrocities, because of these trauma, maternal health issues are skyrocketed in places like Rwanda, Burundi, and other places of genocide. So telling a woman's story impacts the nation in that way, because without understanding maternal health, right, and the impact on the nation, there's no way to understand how population grow, how nations are built. And so women's stories are critical to this. The fact that they are not as included in the story, I personally think hinders what the work that we do, and hinders this notion of peace building, right? Can't peace build without women. Just can't do it. And even I remember going into some of the mass graves and the remains of the mass graves, which is even hard to talk about. I think I was stunned at how many, because it was always like men and then women being like the wives, the children of men. How many women articles were there? So there's some stuff we left out. We all said, isn't that a purse? Isn't that a woman's dress? Isn't that women's shoes? Isn't that? And I remember sitting there thinking, I thought this was a man's story. And so what does it look like without having women's story in that mix? Because clearly it wasn't just a man's story. So women's stories and narratives are critical. And again, as we talk about the work that women do around peace building, around activism, around keeping communities safe, around keeping children safe, including their husbands, right, their sons. And so I think that's been a huge hole, and it has actually stopped us in studying in a way that we could actually get to actual repair. So critical.
Great. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Sharon. I'd like to introduce Patrick Hajayande, a beloved colleague of ours from Burundi, who is joining us on this panel. And I'm hoping, Patrick, you can address both the questions that we've begun speaking of. One, how you address gender in your work on the Burundi genocide, and then also what's missing when we don't address gender as a central aspect of our work.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can
Hey,
hear me.
Patrick. We
Yeah,
can
we
hear
can hear
you.
you.
Hello.
We can hear you.
All right. All right. Yeah, it's nice really to be on this panel. And I just want to take this opportunity to wish a wonderful day for all women in the audience. So let me try to be as quick as possible, because I think time is running. So for the first question, I just want to draw your attention on one notion, one particular thing that I've noticed in my work, which is there, and it's not really something we discuss a lot. So this is what I call, and I noticed this in the case of Burundi. I don't know if in other cases you have seen the same phenomenon, but it's what I call the collective guilt. What do I mean by collective guilt? It means that in the context of Burundi, the widows and orphans had this label of criminals. You understand that they've lost their loved ones, and at the same time, they are suffering a lot. But in addition to all that, in the context of Burundi, these victims of genocide have been also given this label of criminals. In Kirundi, they were called Abamenja, which means they are in the same family of those who tried to overthrow the president who was in power at that time. So as a consequence of these people being described or presented as criminals, they didn't have access to most of their properties, as Dr. Janine described so well. So they lost their properties. Children did not have access to school, and these people were considered as outcasts in the community or wherever they lived. So during my work, when I was shooting a documentary film on the 1972 genocide, there was this case of a lady who said that in order for the children to study, they had first to change their names, so the identity of their father had to be forgotten. And secondly, they had to move to other areas where these people were not known. So these are some of the consequences which were in addition to the suffering these people were going through, because they were considered as guilty as the person who had been killed, because everyone who was killed within the eyes of the government, he was presented as a criminal. So this was the first aspect of the problem with the gender and genocide that I noticed in the context of Burundi. Secondly, when you are talking about the things which are missing is in the context of Burundi, there is what I call the I don't know how I can describe it, but it's like a double silence on what happened. Because in the first time, there was an imposed silence on victims, on all victims of genocide in the context of Burundi. But now, when it comes to women, there was like another silence which was imposed, even when the situation started changing, particularly with the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is actually working in Burundi. And as Dr. Janine said, you see that a lot of men will come out and speak out, but it's as if the silence is still on when it comes to women. So those are some of the issues I wanted to bring to your attention. So if there are any researcher who may be interested in these studies, those are really some particular subject I've noticed which could be of interest to study further and see if there is any similarities in other cases and what could be done. So in order to conclude, and coming back to this idea of the collective guilt, it brings us to the necessity of creating a special space for women to be heard because their stories are particular. And so that even when we are thinking in terms of reparation, there should be a specific space for these women because the suffering they went through is beyond what we could comprehend. So I think we stop there. If there are any other idea to complement, we add that. But now I think that is enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Great. Okay. So I just want to say that with respect to my work, following up on my earlier observation, I think a political focus on women's reproductive capacity undermines their agency, right? I mean, naturalizing gender as a means of reproduction undermines the freedom not to reproduce. And it undermines a vision of family and community in which men share in the work of reproduction, social reproduction, personal growth and development, even as women attain positions of authority and even use the gavel, right? So approaching women in genocidal situations as passive victims reinforces that gendering of agency, so that paradoxically, putting gender at the center of our analyses is a prerequisite for countering a naturalization of gender roles and capacities, right? Sort of assuming, that women must be cared for, must be protected, rather than working with women also so that they can protect themselves. And so as Dr. McAlpin mentioned with respect to the Rwandan genocide, women can be very committed defenders of patriarchy, right? I mean, they can participate in violence insofar as they're caught up in genocidal ideologies. And so one of those genocidal ideologies is homophobia. Jonathan, don't leave yet because we need you. Because the last question, we're almost done, but the last question I'd like to ask our panelists is to consider the relation between gendercide and homophobia in Africa and elsewhere, and how we can be sure to be proactive as these genocidal ideologies sort of spread, both politically and among people on the ground. Who wants to go first?
You want to go first? We stay in the same order. Let me go first. So as we know, throughout history, people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and are gender expansive, queer, and are questioning, intersex, asexual, and two-spirit have been targeted for their sexual orientation, gender identity, or nonconformity to societal norms. In Nazi Germany, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and are gender expansive, queer, and are questioning, intersex, asexual, and two-spirit community were among the groups persecuted and murdered during the Holocaust. With some estimated 100,000, and on purpose by design, I say every word. So people are not letters. I understand, but with an estimated 100,000 lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and are gender expansive, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, and two-spirit individuals arrested and thousands sent to concentration camps. Similarly, during the Rwandan genocide in 1994, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, are gender expansive, queer, and are questioning, intersex, asexual, two-spirit individuals faced persecution and violence, often ostracized and targeted by both Hutu extreme regimens and conservative societal norms. So we talk about coming from both sides. The violence perpetuated against the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or gender expansive, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, and two-spirit individuals in genocidal contexts manifest in various forms, including direct persecution, sexual violence, forced conversion, therapy, and social exclusion. Again, another piece of story that we must tell. Again, critical to understand the full story of what's going on. Many of these individuals were subjected to torture, imprisonment, extrajudicial killing solely based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. Additionally, sexual violence may be used as a means to correct or punish perceived deviations from heteronormative standards, leaving survivors traumatized and marginalized. And so genocide not only targets the physical existence of a particular group, but also seeks to erase the entire culture and identity of a people. Individuals are forced to conceal their identities, undergo conversion therapy for societal ostracisms to conform to oppressive norms. And this erasure of this community deprives individuals of their dignity, autonomy, and right to exist authentically, perpetuating cycles of invisibility and marginalization. So saying that there's challenges in recognition of justice and there needs to be a call to action across the world. We see across the world, many countries, and I tend to say this is like, we'll pick on a particular country, but there are over 32 countries that have laws against gendered identity, with S's and D's of trying to be more inclusive. And so just some of the latest actions that are taken in Ghana, right? And there, the last time I looked, 4 or maybe 7, sorry for not word. They actually have jail time and several, there is actually a sentence of death. So this is a huge human rights issue, huge human rights violation that needs to be addressed and told in the story. The entire story needs to be told. When, where, and how, right? For us to get not only an understanding of what's going on in genocide, but to come up with an answer and a solution to the notion of genocide and mass murders. I think I was a little shocked. You know how on one hand, you know, when she was like, there's only been 5 of these particular acts that have been called genocide. And I remember thinking, 5? When right now there's more than 5 going on. So again, how do we tell the story and against this particular population? So again, how do we tell the entire story and so that we can actually address repair? Thank you.
Okay, I'll make it quick. I'm going to respond to your question in a more general way. Because we've seen how those in power who want to hold on to the power will divide us no matter what. So when there are minoritized groups that are pinned, dehumanized, discriminated against, for some small group to hold on to power, that's wrong. That's human rights violation, like Dr. Bethia just said. So it's not necessarily about what the identity is. Like with this one, it's about identities. Once people are pinned, just because of this, whatever identity, social identities, social constructs we've created, and we make them, we dehumanize, we take away rights for these humans. It's wrong, and we have to stop it. If we're going to fight for human rights, we have to fight for human rights for all, not for some groups. Thank you.
So, okay, I think I'll go now because I listened to Jonathan's presentation earlier, and I was so intrigued when he mentioned that he did a research even from Ghana and also Nigeria, right? I almost snapped my neck when I heard Nigeria, like, oh, wow. So I was interested in asking a question on the willingness of your participants, right, from Nigeria compared to that of Ghana, but there was no time to actually really ask that question. So I'll definitely approach you later. I want to hear more about that. In Nigeria, as we all know, Dr. Bithia, you mentioned about some countries having jail time. Yes. In Nigeria, it's 14 years, right? Again, the question of human rights, the question of you cannot tell the whole world that this is who I am. You dare not. You will be jailed. Straight. That's just it, right? So everyone, I would say this, but I'll say it very carefully. In some states, it is acknowledged, right? We all know that, oh, we have people of different genders, right? And some Nigerians acknowledge that, but no one is brave enough to come out, to speak to it, to speak against the government laws on this, right? Everyone is being careful because no one wants to go to jail at the end of the day. So again, human rights violation, right? How do we talk about things like gender and not talk about it for everyone? How do we segregate that? Oh, gender, we've been speaking about women's experience, right? What about other genders' experience? We've never touched on that. So these are things that we need to start talking about. These are things that we need to start looking into if you're truly serious about human rights. Otherwise, then I think, it's just a farce if you're not talking about this. Thank you.
I think we have to first make a distinction between homophobia and anti-homosexual or anti-gay. You can be opposed or against something without disliking it or fearing it or hating it. The laws, however, that have been so established in, it's actually been updated, Sharon. 67 countries have laws against same-sex relationships. And so the numbers are increasing. Those laws seek to dehumanize people for their sexual, even perceptions, not necessarily acting on these feelings, because there's no policing, right, of people's private spaces, but what it is are laws designed to make these people anti-human, right? It is a denial of their humanity. And so in specific relation to the question asked, how does homophobia relate to gendercide? The relationship is very clear, that if we want to be really serious about assessing and preventing gendercide, we have to look on the kinds of practices at the state level that normalizes violence against people simply based on these many kinds of distinctions. Our keynote speaker made reference to the Genocide Prevention Convention. And within it, it talks about discrimination based on national, religious, or racial group. But the definition has to be expanded to also include, nationalistic group, sexual orientation, etc. We can't talk about human rights and people rights without talking about the right to be different from everyone else. And that's a protected human right. And so if we're going to fully appreciate and understand just the consequences of gendercide, we have to expand our horizons in terms of what it means to be human. We have very stricter notions of what it means to be human, and it means to be normal, to be regular. These are socially constructed norms that remove people from the space of humanity simply because they don't conform to them. We have these very retrograde notions of what it means to be a human and to be dignified to be human. I think of the 10 stages of genocide, and we've spoken about them here at this conference for years ongoing, and we say denial is the last stage, but Patrick's intervention and others indicate that silence is really the last stage of genocide, that genocides persist. We have active genocides, the time in which they happen, but we have many latent and passive genocides that are happening around the world. We will look at the ones where people are obviously being killed, but there are also those where people are being persecuted, who have their humanities and their dignities being violated. And I think those are longer and larger and more consequential genocides, but we miss them because we're simply looking at numbers where people are being killed, while people's humanities are being violated, and we don't think of those as genocidal until it becomes too late, and by the time we notice, people have already been killed.
Absolutely, absolutely. Patrick, would you like to add anything?
I don't think I have much to say. because most of the aspects have been covered. But I just think that homophobia in the context of genocide falls into the same problem of the exclusion. Whenever there are some exclusive policies or discrimination, or these are allowed, I think that's where we see this connection between homophobia and genocide. But in the context of Burundi, it's quite very difficult to describe that. But when we look at what happened, because for now, it's when we are discussing the issue in Burundi, it has this historical aspect of something which happened. And it we relate mainly on these people who were discriminated because of their ethnic or perceived ethnic affiliation. But this, if it is allowed, it can touch anybody whenever those discriminatory or exclusive policies are allowed, they can touch anybody, they can apply in any context. So that's really where I see the problem which we need to deal with, to be able to speak out and not to allow that these discriminatory policies allow it to exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.
Hey, Lisa,
That's a really important
I'm
point.
sorry. Can I say
yeah.
it's just one comment.
Yeah.
Sometimes we detach America from that. Thank you for the correction. 67 until not long ago, it was America. But I remember a comment was made by the keynote speaker, America recognizes the most genocides, except for their own. So that's what I've been wanting to say, that except for their own and their own human rights violation against this community.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So,
So I think that we have brought out in this panel this point, very important point, that gender is not only about men and women, right? It's not only about being gay, straight, or transgender, that it's about gender, how gender difference is mobilized as a political tool, difference itself, just as racial and ethnic difference gets mobilized to monopolize power and wealth, as Janine said. And that this suggests that we should all be careful about how we think about identity and how we work with identity, even in affirmative terms, in order to avoid inadvertently falling into a logic of exclusion, even as we seek to remediate inequality. This is one of the great challenges of the work that we do. But this is why it's important to talk about it. And I want to thank our wonderful panel for bringing all of this up. We're sort of
Thank you,
out of
Lisa.
time, and I haven't had a chance to invite any questions from the audience. I don't know. Yeah, Sharon.
That's it. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. So we'll keep talking over lunch, and we will convene at 12:30 for the opening of the Digital Oral History Archive. Does that happen? Do we have to go elsewhere? Or do we do that here? Do we go to the library?
We start here and then we'll walk to the library, to main library. Yes.
Okay.
If it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the valuable welcome you've added to this conversation. Dr. Janine, reminding, you were talking about the agency of women and liberty, and you were talking about your mother, and again, thank you for sharing your personal lived experience. You talked about how she released your family's Hutu, and I want to understand more. Was that an act of forgiveness or an act of preserving her dignity? I wasn't clear.
It was more for the dignity of that family, that because they were serving as, they were like servants who kept bringing food. Like they would bring baskets of food and beer and all kinds of goods to keep paying back this cow that they received back. Like it was one cow, but they had to pay over the years until like eternity, really. And generations had to keep paying. So they had to really, it was like a bandage in a way, but maybe they were not, there was the time they didn't have enough, but that master who gave a cow had to receive something at the end of the month, every time. So it's like she released them giving them back
Debt
their.
forgiveness.
So it's a debt forgiveness. That's right. It was that debt forgiveness that she canceled, and it was, I mean, that she did. So, yeah, thank you for asking that question.
Good question.
Okay, any others? Before we break for lunch? Camilo?
We talk over lunch.
Okay. we're good.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.